Alright, we are back with a new video, and now that Survivor 43 has wrapped up, I wanted to talk a bit about my personal thoughts on the season, where I know a lot of people say that this season is pretty bad. I heard a lot of people say that this is the worst season ever, and honestly, I just can't really say that. Now, it's not a great season per se, and there are plenty of issues I have with it, but I still feel like there are enough pros with it to where I feel like it is a good enough season of the show. But as usual with my reviews, I like to break them down into four sections, talking about the cast, the production decisions, the editing and presentation, as well as the gameplay. So let's not waste any more time, let's get right into the video. First up, I want to talk about the cast, and honestly, I feel like this is probably the weakest part of the season for me, where I feel like for the most part, this cast doesn't stand out too much compared to some of the more recent seasons on the board. Now, it is a mostly likable cast, and there are some interesting characters within it, but I definitely feel like we are lacking like a truly great character in here. I mean, if we're going through the boots, I mean, we had the first boot in Mariah, who again was largely there. She was pretty under-edited considering she was a first boot, but I can also see that she would have been pretty likable, and people would have felt bad if she were the first boot after seeing her be so likable. So I guess that's why she was under-edited. Then we have Justine, who is probably the biggest dud in the cast. I mean, she doesn't really offer too much for me, and I'm kind of glad she's an early boot here, but she didn't offer too much. NECA was a bit more interesting. She was definitely a fun presence for me, and definitely better positioned coming into her tribe than I give her credit for. It's just a matter of challenge strength that really did her in, but on the whole, like, she did pleasantly surprise me to a degree. Then we have Lindsay, who was my winner pick coming into the season, and seeing her go out in this pretty epic fashion is something at least. Now, admittedly, I feel like it came a bit suddenly for the most part, although there was definitely some foreshadowing there, but I feel like she could have gotten a bit more content in episodes 2 and 3 to set up her downfall a bit better. But again, she's just an interesting case of how paranoia can like lead to your own downfall. Then we have Geo, who again was fine, I guess. He didn't really do much for me. Then we have Ellie, the merge boot, who was definitely one of the bigger characters from the season. I definitely found her very relatable, and one of the moments that really stuck out to me was in episode 2 when she's talking about how she like solved the puzzle and saying how like she grew up like with ADHD and how she was underestimated and how she never saw herself being the one who could do something like finishing the puzzle. I thought that was a very strong moment there. And in general, she was a pretty big character and someone who I wouldn't be surprised to see come back in a future season. Then we have Dwight, who definitely went on the trajectory I saw him going on, where he was mostly ineffective in the game, but even then, there were still plenty of fun dodo moments for him during the season that was mildly amusing, but again, for the most part, I can't say he was a fantastic character per se. Then we have Janine, who was there for the most part. I mean, like, she seems likable enough, but didn't really jump out of the page too much. Then we have James, who definitely could have been a bigger character across the season. And to be fair, he did get a bit more content during the post merge, but for the most part, I felt like he was pretty laid back in the edit. And really, the most memorable thing for me is his voice and the fact that he sounds like he's always standing right in front of a moving fan. But take that or leave it. Then we have Ryan, who was definitely there for the most part. He definitely got some pretty over the top content at certain points, and he was definitely one of these more interesting characters in that regard. But again, he largely did what I expected him to. I didn't really have too much faith in him coming to the season. And it was pretty interesting to see his downfall in the split tribal. Then we have Noelle, who is pretty similar to Ryan as well, where she got a lot of over the top content, especially in the post merge. Like, it was really interesting seeing how they were using her to like fuel like this inspirational story about how she has one leg and how she's struggling a lot, but she's pushing through it nonetheless. I understand that it can come off as a bit exploitative, but personally, I found some of those ones to be pretty funny. But outside of that, she's fine. Not the best character in the world, but I did find that at least noteworthy. Then we have Sammy, who is definitely one of the more interesting characters from the season. Definitely one of the characters with one of the more interesting arcs across the season, where he had like this very strong edit during the pre-merge. And while it wasn't without its faults, it was definitely enough to make him one of the top contenders for me for a decent chunk of the season. But outside of that, he had plenty of funny moments as well, like asking people if they know Patrick Mahomes and him doing the gritty after a challenge, and some of the instances where he just stares at the screen and gets this gym look. I mean, he's definitely like pretty relatable in that regard, and he was pretty fun to watch, but he still had a pretty interesting downfall where in the last couple episodes it was just kind of dunking on him, playing the middle, and people not really respecting his game. So I still find him one of the more interesting characters from the season, though in the grand scheme of things, he's not like a truly epic character. Then we have Cody, who again is another one of the bigger characters from this season. Similar to Sammy, is someone who I had in somewhat high contention for a lot of it. And he had plenty of interesting content in the pre-merge, talking about his philosophy on life and some of his bigger antics, like the whole bead situation. But I do feel like he took a back seat during the post-merge, particularly as Jesse was starting to make more of the decisions between the two of them, to where by the end of it, he just kind of is in the background to a degree, but on the whole, still one of the more likable people from the season. Then we have Carla, who, again, was pretty likable for the most part. She was a pretty interesting character during the pre merge, definitely got a decent amount of content, and definitely was one of the more memorable figures from the season. Though, again, I never really had her in super high contention to actually win, just based on how big her edit was and how much it reminded me of the edits of other big characters that were taken out in the endgame. And that kind of panned out here. Although even then, like, it wasn't the eventual winner who ended up taking her out. So I did find that a bit strange, but again, for the most part, pretty likable, though not like a massive, massive presence for me. Then we have Jesse, who played a very solid game across the season and really fulfilled my expectations from him coming into the preseason, where I really had high hopes for him, and he largely delivered on that. Now, I did question his win equity across a number of points during the season. I felt like he fit the mold of someone like a Carlos, someone who was set up as this big character. And while that eventually panned out and him being taken out in the end game, I did question at certain points whether he could actually win. And we'll obviously talk about that more when we get to the edit section. But again, I feel like he's pretty likable for the most part. He definitely got a lot of very positive and personal content, as well as plenty of strong strategic content as well. And I feel like moving forward, he'll be one of the more memorable people from the season alongside Cody. Then we have Owen, who definitely surprised me to a degree, where he definitely had somewhat of a consistent presence throughout the season, but never one that really led to much of a win per se, where he definitely got consistent content. He definitely came off as a narrator throughout the season, and he did get some content here and there talking about his underdog presence during the season, calling himself Charlie Brown. But again, it was never something that was really leading to a win for me. But again, he was likable enough, though I don't feel like he'll be super well remembered moving forward. Then we have the runner up of the season, Cassidy, who, again, was there for the most part. I mean, again, she seems likable enough. She played in good enough game, I guess. But again, not one of the bigger presences to me. And I felt like had she actually won the season, I would have been a bit underwhelmed, if I'm being perfectly honest. But that's just the impression that I got. And then we have the winner of the season in Gabler. And I will say, first up, the fact that Gabler is a winner or survivor is a fact that I'm very happy with. And again, definitely one of the more satisfying outcomes from a personal perspective. And we'll talk more about his game later on. But again, he was definitely one of the bigger characters from the season, and he was very fun and goofy to watch throughout. And the fact that all of it culminates in him actually winning the season definitely makes a positive impression on the season for me. So all in all, like, I do feel like this is a mostly likable cast. Like, I don't feel like there are a ton of true duds here, but I feel like a lot of the people, even some of the bigger characters, like, definitely don't stand out to me as being truly great characters compared to what we've seen across the last 10 seasons. And yes, while there are certainly a couple people that will probably come back for future seasons, people like a Cody, a Jesse, a Gabler, I feel like in the grand scheme of things, a lot of these people will sort of fade from people's memories as time goes by. But on the whole, I definitely feel like the cast was fine, but not great. Next up, I wanted to talk about some of the production decisions during the season. And obviously, this was the first season to be filmed after production saw the reaction to 41 and the twists and format changes from there. And you can tell that they were making some tweaks in response to that reaction. And for the most part, I feel like the changes that they made were for the better. I don't think they made it worse per se. Although there's still the fact that these elements are in play. Like, obviously, you have the beware advantage, the fact that they had to switch up the task. Now, obviously, they were going to have to do that anyway, because obviously, with something like phrases, obviously, people are going to start looking for phrases and they'll know right away, like when someone says a phrase, or maybe if they saw like Mike, that they'll try to like withhold it until everyone like finds it. And in turn, no one will ever actually say the phrase. So obviously they had to switch it up. And I do like the beats task where it obviously tests your social bonds, but also your ability to like get people to do what you want. And I do like that aspect to it, though I will acknowledge that it did get a bit repetitive by the third time that they did it. But all in all, I don't have too much complaints there. Obviously, one of the bigger changes was them getting rid of the hourglass twist, where like they no longer have like the whole sending someone to exile and reversing the outcome of the challenge, which was the worst part of the hourglass twist. Now, yes, they still have the earn the merge part of it, which I could take or leave. Like, I don't see the point really in the earn the merge element to it, but at this point, especially now without the hourglass, I find it mostly harmless, so I'm actually kind of okay with it. Though ideally, I would prefer it to just be a normal merge round, if I'm being honest. And they also got rid of Do or Die, which obviously was a change for the better, gets rid of a terrible twist, but it also allows us to have a proper Final 7 round. And considering that the Final 7 is normally a very important round in a season of Survivor, I'm glad that they at least brought that aspect to it back. Now, outside of that, you have like the usual stuff like knowledge is power. It's still pretty bad. And the fact that they tried to bring it in twice during the season, they tried to bring it in after Geo had been voted out with it unsuccessfully, was pretty dumb. Like, I think at this point, production should really just cut it out with knowledge is power. I think they should just acknowledge that it's never going to be played successfully, that the only intrigue that comes from knowledge is power is the other players countering it by exchanging idols. But, you know, like, it is what it is. It didn't harm the season too much. Again, because of how unsuccessful it played out. So, on the whole, I feel like this was more the same for the most part, and I still have some of the same issues I have with the new era format, particularly the no swap element to it. But for the most part, I feel like the changes that were made were mostly for the better, and to that end, I do feel like production was pretty good on the season. Next, I wanted to talk about the editing from the season, and this was definitely the most interesting aspect of the season, in that 43 had a very wonky edit. Now, I know some people will say that Edgic is dead and that I shouldn't even pay attention to edit at this point because Erica 141, therefore anything can happen at this point. And I'm not entirely on that train. I do still think that Edgic matters. I still think there are clear trends that you can point to on any given season that can point towards certain people doing well or certain people being set up for downfalls down the road. And if we're looking at the season in hindsight, the edit is there and it definitely explains a lot of what happens here. The issue is that so many people had glaring holes in their edit that it really expanded the list of contenders, and it led to some pretty dramatic shifts in terms of the contenders over the course of the season. Where early on, I said that Lindsay and James were contenders because they were getting the most complex content on Coco, and while Coco wasn't getting too much content, I was reminded of Luvu from 41, who didn't get too much content there, but still contained the winner, so I didn't pay too much credence to that, or at least not until episode 4, where we saw Coco finally get content, and because they finally had to go to Tribal, and Lindsay had her blow up there, which was definitely a bit sudden, but then it was only after we saw Lindsay get voted out that I had to turn back to episode 1, and there was set up there for a downfall where Lindsay obviously lost that first reward challenge, and she said that the game was harder than she expected after getting content about her saying that she had prepared for years for this, you know, like really setting her up to be out of her depth there. And then James just didn't get that much content to begin with, and I feel like he didn't explain his move to cut Lindsay super well. So through that definitely presented holes to James's edit moving forward. I said later on that Sammy and Cody were contenders and that they were having the most consistent storylines across the season. But even then, like, they had flaws in their edit. Like, Sammy had a very wonky premiere where he said that he didn't want to do the Savvy Challenge because he didn't want to show off his intelligence. But then he not only allows the tribe to do the Savvy Challenge, but he's literally the one that solves the puzzle. So he immediately undermines himself there. But then literally thereafter, we see his edit spike up where he gets credit for creating this guys alliance, and he does seem to be a focal point moving forward. And I probably would have paid more credence to the premiere and the issues that I saw with that. But with everyone else just kind of being middling, I kind of assumed that Sammy would have to be a frontrunner because of that. And I thought the same with Cody as well, where Cody was pointed out for by Jesse for taking the Beware advantage, even though he should have known better. But I justified that by saying that like Cody was able to get all the beads anyway, and he was able to take that risk and it was able to pay off. And then moving forward, I felt like that was leading to something. And then even outside of that, the fact that he didn't say his philosophy more in the premiere, that was more in episode 2, that was an issue there. But again, with the fact that the other contenders had clear holes in their edit, I kind of brought the Cody because of that. And yes, while they do eventually get taken out, it was a realization that I only made so deep into the season once their flaws became way too big to ignore, with Sammy blatantly getting undermined in the edit during the post-merge, and then Cody just taking a complete back seat and not getting credit for big moves that were happening. I said that Jesse and Carla were never strong contenders because despite their strong personal content and despite them coming off as these traditional winners, or at least on paper early on, that they were being set up more as big players and that they were going to be set up for downfalls later on, and that the winner of the season would be the one to take down those players more so than them being the winners themselves. And I was just waiting for that moment where Carla would be cut. I was waiting for that moment where Jesse would be blindsided, and it just took way longer into the season than I was expecting. And that delay made me think that maybe they were contenders. I thought maybe that because 41 and 42 did not have dominant winners, that it was making me unable to realize that maybe this season could have a dominant winner. And in turn, I wasn't sure how the new era was going to edit their dominant winners. And it made me reconsider, but I mean, not Carla per se, but Jesse for sure. It made me think that maybe Jesse would have a shot because, again, he was going to be a dominant winner, and I wasn't sure if the show was tricking us by using our expectations from 41 and 42 to present us with this dominant winner in plain sight, only for that to be snatched away. So because of that, I did have Jesse in contention despite my issues with his edit, despite the fact that he didn't have too much of a storyline by him, beyond him just talking about him being a big player and beyond him just occasionally bringing up his family in the end game. And I think the biggest of all was Cassidy, where I kept going back and forth on Cassidy, where there were clear points in the season where I was somewhat high on her. Like I felt her premiere was good enough. I felt like there were certain other episodes during the season where she was going to be in high contention. But even then, I felt like she wasn't being propped up enough. I felt like she wasn't getting enough credit for big moves either. I felt like she was more so just a consistent presence, someone who was able to vote out everyone who ever targeted her during the game. And I know I said early on that she was probably just this decoy, sort of similar to Erica, where that confessional in the premiere about her laying back was going to be used to make people think that she was going to win because of the similarities to Erica, and then her just continuing to get a edit like that would probably make people think that Cassidy would win because of the similarities to Erica. But even then, I feel like Erica is getting propped up more in the endgame. I felt like Erica was getting a more consistent storyline. So even with Cassidy, I had reservations there. But because everyone else had big holes in their edit, I was willing to overlook those things. I was willing to prop her up despite those things, because what other option was there? So that's really the story behind the season, where I recognized so many flaws with so many of the different players that it made it hard for me to really consider who the top contenders were. And even with the people that I would put at number 1 or number 2 in their edits, like I didn't say it was a runaway thing. I felt like there were clearly holes in the edits of so many of these people. But because everyone had holes, I mean, somebody had to win. Somebody had to emerge into the spotlight at some point. So that was really something that I had to contend with over and over again. And then we get to Gabler, who is largely on the same boat, where there are plenty of issues with his edit. His premiere was actually pretty good, but then after that, I mean, he definitely had a pretty big slump there in episode 2 and 3, where he mostly got a dodo edit there. Like, I felt like they weren't really propping him up too much. And even when he was getting content talking about Ellie and Janine and targeting them, I felt like so much of the content was focused specifically around that I felt like, yes, he was probably going to win the battle between those two, but that was probably going to be it for his story across the season. And at the merge, well, he is the one that drives that, and he is the one getting credit for the Ellie move. I felt like, again, with the edit, that was pretty much going to be it for a storyline, and that he wasn't going to have much of a purpose beyond that. But then, to his credit, after he gets out Ellie in that next episode, they do give him some positive content there. They do set him up moving forward. He talks about how he's going to be the alligabler and he's going to go below the surface and sort of play under the radar. And yes, that is a bit of an issue with his edit, is that we don't really see much of his positive relationships with the jurors, to where even at the time I was doing my jury scenarios video, I felt like there weren't too many solid relationships with Gabler to other people on the jury that would probably vote for him. I mean, yes, he does get positive content with Ryan, and I did say that Ryan was probably going to be a vote for him in a lot of scenarios. But beyond that, it was hard for me to see, based on the show, people really seeing Gabler as this great player. I felt like the vibe I got was that people liked him and that they saw him as this sweet old guy, but not someone that they respected and someone that they saw as playing that good of a game. But then by the time we get towards the end game, he does get more content again. He is one of the first people to bring up targeting Jesse and recognize that him and Cody are these big threats that need to be taken out. And that made me think that Jesse was being set up for a downfall around that final 7 round. But then that doesn't happen. I mean, the final 7 just comes and goes without Jesse ever being brought up as a target. Then we get to the final 6, where Gabler does have that pretty good confessional about how he's like the assassin and how you don't storm the castle, you go in and slip poison into the king's bowl and then walk out. So again, they are perpetuating that storyline of him playing under the radar, but still him like playing a good game. And then that does culminate at the final 4, where he is ultimately the one to beat Jesse and Fire. But even then, I felt like they would have done more to prop him up. And to be fair, some of that could just be because he doesn't actually win the immunity challenge. The way I would have seen Gabler winning the game coming into the finale was him winning immunity and then giving up that immunity to take on Jesse himself, rather than someone else winning immunity and putting him in the fire against Jesse. And he does win in pretty dominant fashion, both against Jesse in the fire making challenge and then obviously in the jury vote. But I think on the whole, there are definitely pros and cons to Gabler's winning edit, where, yes, on one hand, there are the holes in the edit. Again, pre-merge wasn't fantastic, and I felt like they didn't do much to set himself up for a storyline beyond the Ellie boot, at least before the Ellie boot that I was aware of. And then afterwards, I felt like the edit didn't do that great of a job of focusing on Gabler's relationships with people that would translate into them actually voting for him at the end. And that made it hard for me to come up with any concrete locked votes for Gabler, to where it was hard for me to see him practically winning a jury vote despite the edit being there. But on the other hand, he does have a consistent storyline throughout the season. I mean, in the pre-merge, he does get the storyline about him taking on Ellie and then him being set up to win that battle. And then immediately after he gets out Ellie, he gets a new storyline where he is going to play this under the radar game and that he's going to be this assassin that's going to eventually take all the big threats. And he does get set up to that by mentioning Jesse as this big threat before anyone else recognizes Jesse as that big of a threat. So it's not as if Gabler's win comes completely out of nowhere. There is elements of a winner edit here. But again, like so many other people in the season, there were enough holes in his edit that made me seriously question whether he could actually win, namely the relationships aspect to it. But in the end, that's ultimately what ends up happening. He does have those relationships that translates to him winning. And through that, I honestly feel like he is one of the more satisfying winners from the season. But on the whole, I did feel like the editing from this season is pretty wonky, to where, yes, on one hand, it was definitely hard to predict, and it was very fun to follow, to where I didn't know who the winner was for a decent amount of the season, despite me doing my best to analyze the edit. But on the other hand, I feel like the edit could have done a much better job at showing some of the game moves from the winner that could actually explain why Gabler eventually wins the season, as I feel like with the reaction we've been getting from people, that it'll lead to people believing that Gabler did not play that good of a game and that he probably will go down as one of the weirdest and one of the worst winners in history, despite me not thinking that's the case. So I do feel like that's one possible downside to this edit, and is that we obviously don't have a great understanding of what happened during certain rounds of the game. But all in all, the chaoticness of the edit made it for a pretty fun watch. So to me, the editing from the season was a double edged sword. And finally, I want to talk a bit about the gameplay from this season. And admittedly, I feel like the gameplay wasn't fantastic, though I feel like compared to 41 and 42, it's not that far off the mark compared to it. Where I feel like the format issues that I have with the new era really carry over into the pre merge, where one of my biggest complaints with the new era is that the lack of tribe SWATs coupled with the small tribes makes for pretty standard votes during a lot of this pre merge. And I feel like that carries over here, where for the most part, these pre-merge boots are not super interesting. I mean, yes, the Lindsay vote was kind of sort of interesting, but it was more so due to Lindsay blowing up her own game than any masterful manipulation on someone else's end. It's not as if there was this massive blindside per se. And then beyond that, every other vote was mostly consensus. I mean, Mariah was mostly a consensus vote. Justine was a mostly consensus vote. NECA even was a more consensus vote. And then even Geo, I mean, yes, while that was a 3-2 vote, that was pretty locked in, and there really wasn't too much intrigue there. Though, to be fair, I mean, it could have been slightly interesting had Geo played the Knowledge is Power properly, but again, he didn't, and it mostly led to a mostly standard vote there. The merge round with Ellie going out, I mean, it appears to be a big move, at least in terms of Gabler's winning game, but the actual vote itself was pretty standard, where it really felt like Ellie was overplaying, and in turn, it just allowed most of the people to just pile all their votes onto Ellie. So by the end of it, it wasn't a super interesting vote. The Dwight vote was a bit more interesting, though admittedly, it was still a largely consensus vote there as well, with the majority of the Coco plus Cody and Jesse contingent holding true. And yes, while it was interesting, like how we do see Jesse getting two idols out of this because Dwight handed the idol to Jesse there, I felt like that was another issue with the edit, is that we never get an explanation for why Dwight gave the idol to Jesse to begin with. It's just something that kind of happens. And then we get to the Janine vote. Again, standard vote, nothing too fancy there. The split tribal is where things get a bit more interesting, where we do at least have one interesting tribal with the Jane's vote. Now, yes, it was a 4-1 vote, and a lot of it was stacked against Jane's anyway with how the tribes broke down there, but even so, it was interesting seeing Noelle use her vote steal pretty effectively to basically, like, lull James into a false sense of security into not using his knowledge as power there. And plus, you also have Sammy, like, convincing Carla to throw her vote onto James, even though that doesn't really help her game that much. But on the whole, I did find that to be a pretty interesting vote. On the other hand, the Ryan vote was pretty standard, not too much to say there. Then we get to the Noelle blindside, which was pretty good for the most part. Again, not a massive move, but again, good enough there. Then we get to the Sammy round, which did seem like Sammy blowing up his game more, to where it does feel like a lot of the votes were on to him because he announced in front of the tribe that he was going to use a shot in the dark. But again, it was still fun seeing Sammy have a downfall there. Then we get to what's probably the biggest move of the season with the Cody blindside. Again, that's a great tribal, great blindside, great use of the idol to where Jesse is able to use the idol on Owen and in turn get Carla to flush her own idol so that she could potentially be vulnerable at the final five. And just seeing all the reactions there is pretty fun there. And then we get to the final couple of votes with the Carla vote out at the final five, which I do question to a degree, particularly on Jesse's end, where I do still think that Jesse probably would have been better off voting out Cassidy in that spot. As yes, it is true that Carla is a big jury threat and everything, but I feel like had Jesse vote out Cassidy there, that it would have increased his odds of winning that final immunity challenge, as obviously Cassidy was better suited for that challenge. And plus, it reduces the chance of his worst case scenario of going into fire against someone like a Gabler, for example. And yes, while Jesse probably sucked at fire to begin with, he probably would have absolutely needed that final immunity anyway. I think that only solidifies my view that the Cassidy vote was probably the right play at the final five versus Carla or whatever. And then we get to the final round with obviously Cassidy winning immunity, putting Jesse in a fire, losing. And then we get to the final tribal, which did seem to be pretty decisive for the most part, particularly because a lot of the jury was pretty open between Gabler and Cassidy there. And a lot of it did seem to come out to some of the responses there. Now, yes, we'll still need to learn more from more exit press, but it was interesting seeing these players contend for a lot of it. And it really felt like some of the answers mattered here that ultimately decided the winner here. And I guess we can talk a bit about Gabler as a winner, to where I know people will say that Gabler's a bad winner, like they see him as this loose cannon, but if you actually look at the way that he played, it actually wasn't that bad for the most part, where he was in the majority for most of the game. Obviously, he was in the majority early on, like voting out Mariah there. And yes, while he was on the bottom, like with the whole Ellie and Janine situation, it didn't feel like he was in too much danger going home beyond that, especially once like the men's alliance seems to solidify. So even then, I felt like had they gone to another tribal, that they probably would have gotten the other upper hand over Ellie and Janine. And then we get to the merge where we get to what's probably the highlight of Gabler's game in that he does get the ball rolling on the Ellie blind side. And yes, while you could attribute a lot of that to Ellie blowing up her game by trying to play both sides, I still had to give Gabler some credit for spearheading that move. And it does seem like he got the bulk of the credit for the move by the end of the season. And then after that, he's able to go back into the background where from that point on, he's essentially playing the middle between the Baka group plus Noel and then the majority, which is the Cocos plus Cody and Jesse. Now, he is on the outs during the Dwight vote, but after that, he is in the majority the rest of the way. He votes correctly at every single tribal moving forward, and it does seem like people trust him and they do view him as a number for their alliance. Now, admittedly, he isn't driving too many votes. Like, while he is the first to present Jesse and Cody as these big threats, it's ultimately other people that ultimately decide that, to where at the final six, it's largely Jesse's decision to flip on Cody that wins the day there. And then at the final four, it was obviously at the point where everyone knew that Jesse was this big threat at that point. So really, I mean, the fact that Gabler was the first to bring it up, but was unsuccessful to do so until like it was really deep into the game, probably isn't ideal. But again, like he did have good relationships with a lot of the cast. A lot of people trusted him and were willing to include him on a lot of their plans. And he was rarely targeted. I mean, he literally is the only person by the end of the season to never have a single vote cast against him. And he was even one vote away from the third perfect game in Survivor history, only not getting James's jury vote. So again, if we're looking at his actual track record, he's actually voting pretty sensibly for the most part, and he's able to effectively position himself to get towards the end of the game. Now, admittedly, I do feel like there is a question of jury chances outside the one he was in, to where I do think he loses to Jesse. I think that much is pretty clear. Does he lose against Carla? I mean, we'll have to see more from Exit Press, but I'm inclined to think that he does lose to Carla. So he did need to get into that scenario of him, Cassidy, and Owen there. But I feel like once he was there, he was able to differentiate himself pretty well from those other two while still having a good enough game to get the edge over someone like a Cassidy, who largely hid behind the power players for a lot of the game and was unable to really take credit for the moves that James and Carla were making during that pre-merge there. So while I can't say that Gabler is a great winner, I wouldn't put him in my top tier per se. I also don't think he's a bad winner either, and I do think there's enough merit to his game to where I would at least have him above Marianne on a winner ranking. Now, compared to Erica, I still think he's probably below her, though I do feel like they're relatively close at the end of the day. So on the whole, while the edit didn't present Gabler as his really great player, I do feel like there's enough merit to his game to where he is a satisfying enough winner by the end of it. So on the whole, I feel like the gameplay from the season was largely on the same level as 4A1 and 4A2, where you have a relatively tame pre-merge, and then even like a lot of the early merges relatively stable for the most part. And it really isn't until the game gets down to single digits that things get a bit more interesting, and it does lead to a relatively interesting end game. Now, I do still feel like it is harmed to a degree by the format. Like, again, the small tribes, no swaps, which I do think 44 is rectifying to a degree. I believe 44 is planning to have a swap here, which I think will definitely help. I think it could make the game a bit more dynamic, particularly in the pre-merge. But again, we'll just have to see. So on the whole, I feel like 43 is largely a continuation of the show that we've been getting during this new era, where I don't think it's bad. I know a lot of people say that the new era is bad and that the show's gone completely downhill and everything, but really, I still come away liking this season. I think there's enough merit to this season and enough good moments from this season and enough good things to talk about this season that really prop it up. I think for the most part, the cast is pretty likable. And yes, while they're not super memorable for a lot of it, I still think there's enough likable people here that make it a bit worth it. I think editing is another thing that makes the season pretty notable as well. Like just the whole experience of watching this season live and not knowing for sure who's going to win made it a very interesting read. And yes, while it could lead to more people saying that Edgic is dead, I still think it was a mostly entertaining ride. And I think even from gameplay, again, I still have complaints with the way gameplay is done in the new era, but I don't think it's significantly worse than what we saw in 41 and 42 either. And it still had plenty of good enough moments, but especially that Cody blindside. And it's all those things that lead me to like this season, but not have it in super high regard. So there we go. That will do it for this week's video. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe. It really helps out with the channel. Now I am planning to do a player ranking for Survivor 43 as well, where I'm going to be ranking all the players based on the games that they played, so stay tuned for that. I am doing some stuff for the end of the year, like I am planning to do some more general Survivor content moving forward, as well as coverage for other shows coming up soon, like The Circle Season 5 and Australian Survivor Heroes vs. Villains, so stay tuned for that. And if you haven't already, be sure to join my Discord server, which I'll leave a link to join in the description. There's a lot of stuff coming your way, but for now, that's the video. See ya.